morning, people of St. Mark's and any others out there in cyberspace. Welcome to our third session on interesting things from the Bible. We will today deal with the Apocrypha. And before starting, let me say that if you have a Bible at home and you're searching for the Apocrypha and you don't have it, that is too bad. It ought to be in the Bibles of Episcopalians because we read from it in church. So if you want to get a good Bible, both read, study, and has the Apocrypha, go to Amazon and look for the New Oxford Annotated Bible, New Revised Standard Version with Apocrypha. You can, if you didn't get that written down and you really are interested, you can either email me or email Shay and I will write that out. Now I will begin to tell you why a lot of Bibles sold don't have it. It goes back to this side of the Reformation. In the Roman Catholic Bible, in the Eastern Orthodox Bibles, those books are included, or at least some of them, and not the same group in both RC and Orthodox, in the Old Testament. The reason that we don't have them as Anglicans, and the reason Protestants don't have them, even read from them, goes back to the Reformation. It goes back to the King James Version. And the King James Version did translate the Apocrypha and include it, but good luck in trying to find a King James Version that has an Apocrypha bound with it. The Puritans, you know what my opinion of the Puritans are, who wrote nearly everything in the Church of England, decided it shouldn't be in at all, and in their own Calvinist Geneva Bible, they were not published with that Bible. And then, after the Puritans took over in the Commonwealth, if you heard my Anglican lectures, you will know that was not a good time because we were outlawed as a church at that time when Oliver Cromwell was leading England. Then they pretty well went away. But they did come back for Anglicans. Let me tell you that in our own Book of Common Prayer, there are 3 morning prayer canticles that come from the Apocrypha. One of them is one of my favorites. It goes on forever. It's called the Benedicite Omnia Opera Domini, and starts out, all you works of the Lord, praise ye the Lord. Bless ye the Lord. Praise him and magnify him forever. O you suns, moon, and stars. Bless ye the Lord. Praise him and magnify him forever. And then it goes on to mountains and hills and rivers and streams and frost and cold and parking lots and stop signs. I made up those last 2. But it's a wonderful thing. And I live on top of a hill in Eagle Rock, and my backyard view is to die for. And sometimes I will come out in the morning and just look at the York Valley, Oxdale College, the foothills, and the San Gabriel Mountains, and I will just begin to say, oh, all you works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. So we have that. We also read in our lectionary from the Apocrypha, and the one I remember most is the one that comes from All Saints' Day, Ecclesiasticus. Let us now praise famous men. Ecclesiasticus in most editions of the Apocrypha now is called the Wisdom of Sirach, but that is Ecclesiasticus. All right, so that's why for Anglicans and Protestants it's a separate group of books, generally printed between the Old and New Testament, which is the place it should go. A lot of that writing comes from the Exile, and I will talk about that now because you might not remember the Babylonian captivity and the Exile. Here is a the Reader's Digest condensed version of Jewish history. The 3 Jewish kings of a united Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. After Solomon's death, the country split in 2, with the 2 southern tribes becoming Judah and the 10 north tribes becoming Israel. And then the Assyrians attacked the northern kingdom of Israel and pretty well destroyed it in 760 BC, the Assyrians did, and carried some of their people off, and there was a great diaspora, and that was called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Not everyone got lost. Some Jews were there, but they began to use pieces and bits of Assyrian culture or religion so that by the time of Jesus, those people were not considered full Jews and were hated. By that time, the northern kingdom was known as Samaria, and that's why the Jews hated the Samaritans. And as a trivial aside, the Samaritans still exist. There are about 700 to 800 of them. They still have their temple on Mount Gerizim, and they still offer sacrifices. They have some problems genetically because of inbreeding, like genetic deafness. But if you want to find out about the modern Samaritans, just go to YouTube and put in the question, modern day Samaritans. So, that left Judah, and Judah was conquered by the Babylonians. Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. The temple was destroyed, and the people, at least the elite, the educated, were carried off to Babylon in captivity, and there they had to live for a good long time. And so a lot of work in Judaism was done not in Israel, in Jerusalem, but in Babylon. That is where Ezekiel wrote his book, for instance. And this is where you get a lot of the apocryphal books. They are written in Babylon, under the Babylonians, but then the Babylonians got conquered by the Persians, and so you get part under Persians. So with a person like Daniel, he begins with the Babylonians and ends with the Persians. And King Cyrus of Persia was a very broad-minded fellow and let any of the Jews go back to Israel to rebuild the temple that if they wanted to, and some did. You'll read about that in the Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, that's sure, in a nutshell, kind of thing on the history of Israel and the Babylonian captivity, also called the Exile. Now, there they are rebuilding the temple, and the prophets are speaking, and then the Old Testament quits, and then we begin with the New Testament and Jesus, and what happened in between. Well, that is found in the book of Maccabees, which I will talk about in a moment, and some other things. And we know that these books were read, certainly in the latter part of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, because of the popularity of a musician. His name was George Frederick Handel. He wrote The Messiah, wherein is the Hallelujah Chorus. He also wrote several more oratorios, but he wrote Judas Maccabeus, and he wrote Susanna. And it will be those two characters that I will talk about today. Okay, now, those apocryphal books, incidentally, also appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they were being read back then too. Now, here's where an interesting thing happens. You read the first chapter of 1 Maccabees, and it talks about no one less than Alexander the Great. And it talks about how Alexander the Great conquered the known world, but after his untimely death, it was divided up amongst his generals, and there were 4 divisions, but to make a long story short, 2 of them became kind of dominant. One was the Seleucid Empire, which was basically Syria all the way east to Afghanistan and parts of northern India, and the other one was Ptolemaic, that was Egypt, very rich, okay? Now, I would like to give a little thought to what happened in Jerusalem after Alexander died and after the Greek culture began to come in. So, the Greek culture and religion is now pretty much dominant over much of the earth because of Alexander the Great. And Greek culture began to change Jewish religion and culture, and this process of becoming Greekified, there's a real word for Greekified, and it is Hellenized. Hellenization. Hellas is the Greek word for Greek, so it means Greekified. They wanted the people to assimilate into Greek culture, language, and religion. So, 1 Maccabees opens with this problem. So, because they didn't want to be Greeks, but apparently some of them embraced it. Now, the villain of the book of 1 Maccabees is the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He invaded and conquered the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and then continued on to conquer Jerusalem and Judea and Palestine and those places because he could do it, and he took them over and away from Egypt. Now, the Roman Empire threatened to invade to invade Antiochus Epiphanes IV if he kept Egypt. He had to let that go, but he certainly took Jerusalem and ransacked the temple and just pushed hard on this Hellenization thing to make the Jews more like the Greeks. So he tried to suppress Judaism. Now, he succeeded with a lot of people. I mean, people want to be with the top knobs, and a lot of people wanted to be friends with the Greeks and socialize with the Greeks and be part of the upper crust and all of that. So they did. They fraternized a lot, and the Orthodox Jews had a fit about that. One of the things they had the most fits about was their young men going off to the gymnasium. Why, you ask, should gyms be a problem for Orthodox Jews? It was a problem because the Greeks exercised in the nude. And this was shocking. It was shocking to Jews to think that people would just run around naked, throwing balls and javelins and stuff, and that was just highly upsetting to them. It also caused another problem because the young Jewish men who wanted to be like the Greeks noticed right off the bat, exercising, that their male parts looked different from the Greek male parts. And that, of course, is because Jews were circumcised at birth, and Greeks thought circumcision was a barbarian thing to do, a mutilation of the body. It was even said by some writers in those days that some of the Jewish men had found a way through some kind of surgery to erase the marks of their circumcision. I doubt that. And the reason I doubt that is that in the 21st century, circumcision has once again come under fire by a lot of people who think it's a bad idea, but they haven't come up with a way to do it in the 21st century, so I doubt if they did back then. Now, these things really upset Orthodox Jews. And Antiochus Epiphanes IV, so wanting to suppress Judaism and introduce everything Greek, made it unlawful to circumcise baby boys. Now just imagine, made it unlawful, against the law, to circumcise. People had to go out in the hills and forest and hide and have them all come by to do the circumcision. It was a shocking thing. He also put statues of Greek gods in the temple. Indeed, he put a statue of Olympian Zeus in the temple and then sacrificed a pig. I cannot begin to express or even think of something that would be as shocking to us today. That was called by the Jews the abomination of desolation. And sitting at my house thinking, what would be as shocking to the parishioners of St. Mark's as that was to the Orthodox Jews? And the worst I could come up with is someone put a full-size statue of Satan by the pulpit with the rack of votive lights to burn, and then sacrificed a rattlesnake. That was as close as I could get. Ooh, what a terrible thought. So, that caused a rebellion of the Orthodox Jews. So, Antiochus Epiphanes not only had that happening in Jerusalem, the capital city, he took it out into the countryside, into the small towns. So there it was. Now, one such town was called Modane. There, Antiochus's official orders were the people had to sacrifice to the Greek gods. And one of the town's leaders, Mattathias, opposed the king's official vocally, standing up against Jews being made to sacrifice to pagan gods. While he was opposing the king's deputy, one of the town's citizens came to the pagan altar and made ready to sacrifice. Mattathias exploded in anger, killed the citizen, and then killed the king's official. The die was cast. The revolution was on. Mattathias called on all true Jews to join him and then fled into the wilderness. There, Mattathias chose one of his sons to be their general, and his name was Judas Maccabees. Maccabees means hammer, hammer of the Greek enemy. They gathered an army, and Judas Maccabeus first attacked the towns of Hellenized Jews. Now, as I said, some Jews went right along with this Hellenization thing, skipping everything from circumcision to temple sacrifice. So when he conquered these Hellenized Jewish towns, he forcibly circumcised all the adult Jewish males who had not been circumcised. Painful punishment. He then went on to beat the Syrian Greek general Apollonius. Then General Lysias takes over and Judas Maccabeus defeats his army. So Lysias has to go back to Antioch to regroup. Judas Maccabeus takes advantage of this lull and takes his army to Jerusalem and retakes the temple, which had been looted and defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember the statue of Zeus and the sacrifice pig. So Judas Maccabeus and his people repaired the temple, got new adornments, tore down the defiled altar and built a new one, made new temple vestments and vessels, and had an 8-day prayer service of dedication of the temple. The 8-day feast of the dedication is actually mentioned in the New Testament when it says Jesus was walking in the temple during the feast of the dedication. And it is still around today, but now it is called Hanukkah. And you've heard of that. Some of us has even celebrated one of the nights of Hanukkah with their Jewish friends. It's a nice thing. However, the Hanukkah story about the oil in the menorah lasting for 8 days does not appear in 1 Maccabees, but seems to be a later legend appearing in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, after the dedication, there follows many battles and court intrigues, which makes reading the book a little heavy at times, trying to figure out who's trying to come out on top. However, one memorable scene concerns a brother of Judas Maccabeus, Eleazar. In that battle, the king's general, that is to say, Antiochus Epiphanes' general, was using battle elephants. That's even more frightening than you might think, because the Syrian Greeks, before sending the elephants into battle, made a drink of crushed mulberries and grapes, which they fermented and gave to the elephants, who drank gustily and went half tipsy into battle, mean as a hornet. So Eleazar sees one of these elephants, and this elephant is dressed with magnificent drapings. They vested their elephants for war and thought it must be the king himself. So Eleazar runs fighting his way to that elephant, killing everyone in his path. Eleazar then rolled under the elephant and, thrusting his spear upward into this elephant's stomach, he killed the elephant. But alas, whether from lack of planning or as an act of martyrdom, the elephant fell straight down on Eleazar and squashed him to death. This was a favorite scene of many European painters. Now, Judas Maccabeus was himself killed in that battle and was succeeded by his brother Jonathan. All right. Jonathan also died and was succeeded by his brother Simon. Simon succeeded in cleansing the Gentiles. In other words, the Jews won, the Hellenized Jews lost, the Greek Gentiles lost, okay? The Jews were now in command of their own country. So they were now running their own show, in effect, an independent Jewish state, until Romans conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC. Now you can see why even modern day Jews read Maccabees and know the story of the Maccabees and teach it to their children, because that was the first time since all of those people had conquered it, good Lord, that it was an independent state for that short period of time, or a little more than 100 years. Well, that is why First Maccabees is important. It tells us the story in between, and we need to know that. We could have read it from Jewish sources if it weren't in Anglican Bibles, We could have read it from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we've had it in our Anglican Bibles. It is in the Bible, but not of the Bible, I guess we could say, because it's not canonical. At the time of the King James Version, when they put it in, the point was made that it should be read for education and edification. It told things that were necessary and were good and were pious, but it could not be used to prove doctrine. All right, no problem. And then followers of the Puritans just dropped it out completely. And I'm afraid sometimes American Episcopalians don't have Bibles that have it in it, which is why I recommended the New Oxford Annotated Bible, New Revised Standard Version with Apocrypha from Amazon. I should get a discount on Amazon for the times I recommend it to church. So, there it is. Follow that story again with the, in a nutshell, history. In 760 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, leaving the southern kingdom of Judah intact. In 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took the Jewish leadership and elite as captives to Babylon. This was known as the Babylonian captivity or the exile. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and King Cyrus let those Jews who wished to return to Israel to begin to rebuild the temple, books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Then Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. When Alexander the Great died, 323 BC, I think, the Greek Empire was divided up between his generals. There were 4 parts of it, and that gradually became 2 very powerful parts of it, being dominant, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. The Maccabees fought the Seleucids until they made Israel Jewish again. So, from 164 to 63 BC, that short period, it was a Jewish state once more until 63 BC when the Romans conquered it. Under the Romans, in 70 AD, the temple was completely destroyed, as was Jerusalem, and the Jews became a diaspora until the state of Israel was restored in 1948. So that's why this is an important book. Important especially to Jews who celebrate the rededication of the temple every year at Hanukkah, but also important for us to know what happened in between there. So that is the story of First Maccabees, which then brings us to the second one, but I'm going to tell you a few little synopses of a few other books. I'm going to talk about Susanna and the Elders because it deals with sexual harassment. That'll be one of those slightly naughty things again if you need to send the children away, but not terribly bad. The others are, there's some interesting books. If you get a good modern translation of it, you would find some of these just actually very, very fun to read. One is the Book of Tobit. Now, Tobit, so says the introduction in the Oxford Annotated, combines a Jewish novella. It's a work of fiction. Combines ethical exhortation and prayers with broad humor, a rollicking plot, and vivid characters. And so it does. I'll give you a preview here, a trailer of it. As it starts out, Tobit's big thing, he's an Orthodox and pious Jew, is when he finds a dead Jew somewhere, just left by the side of the road, he buries his fellow Jews. That's his act of piety. But one night, it's a hot night, so he goes out in his garden and snuggles up next to a wall and falls asleep. But he falls asleep under a tree filled with birds. Now, if any of you have ever parked your car under a tree filled with birds, you will know what happens next. All the birds defecate from the tree, and the droppings fall into the eyes of Tobit, and he is blinded. Well, that's an interesting way to start a story. So poor Tobit is blinded, and he just figures, he'll just pray to the Lord, just take me, Lord, now. I'm not going to be much good for anything, blinded by all the bird poop. So, take me now. And then there is a friend of his, or perhaps some kind of distant cousin named Sarah. And Sarah is as depressed and despondent as Tobit is, but hers is for another reason. The demon, Asmodeus, has fallen in love with Sarah, so that each time Sarah gets married, Asmodeus shows up and kills the bridegroom before he can consummate the marriage. She's had 7 husbands and no honeymoon night so far. And she is engaged to the son of Tobit. There's your trailer. It's a great book to read, okay? And then there is the Song of the Three Young Jews, and that's one of the things. Well, there are two canticles for morning prayer in our prayer book from the song, they call it, of the Three Young Men. And the Song of the Three Young Jews is actually fleshing out the story that shows up in Daniel. And the 3 young Jews, I bet you've heard of them, are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they are in the fiery furnace. There's even a song about that, I think. And the flames are raking about them, but God is protecting them. And so they are singing these hymns of praise to God in the fiery furnace, and 2 of those show up in our Book of Common Prayer. They're really very nice. Another book that's kind of fun is Bel, that's the first story, and the dragon. They're bound together. And that story about Bel was a god. He was a Persian or Babylonian god, whichever one that happened under. And he would be fed, and the doors would be locked, and the next morning all the food would be gone. And so the king took Daniel in and said, "See, you can't deny he's a god. He eats all the food puts there." And Daniel said, no, king, let me just work a little experiment. So Daniel goes along. Before the doors were shut, he takes fine ash, and he sprinkles that ash on the floor. And the food is brought in, and the doors are shut. And the next morning the king says, "See, Daniel, the food is all gone." And says, "Now, your majesty," said Daniel, "look at the floor." And the king said, "Well, I see footprints of women, children, and men." He said, "That's who ate the food." So they bring out the priest with a sword to their throat, and they admit and show them they have a secret hole under the altar, and they come up and they feast on all that. So that's how Daniel got rid of that god. Now the dragon was a large serpent, apparently. This is a real live creature that they had, and the king is saying, see, this you can't deny, he's alive and he's eating all the time, My guess is that someone had visited Africa and had obtained a large python. That would look like a dragon to anyone who didn't have it. It looks like a dragon to me when I look at the ones in South Florida. So, that's what was happening. So Daniel mixes up pitch, that's tar, and various other things to feed this snake, so that when it gets into its stomach, it will expand and blow up the snake. And that's what happens. So the next day they go there, and this green and pitch thing that Daniel had made up has exploded the belly of the snake, which lies laying dead, a dead python. And the king has to admit he wasn't a god either. Okay, those are some of the stories. The Wisdom of Sirach is a wonderful gathering of something like the Book of Proverbs, but even having things that, had we had it in the Bible, God says to honor the physician. That would stop a lot of craziness about, anti-vaxxers and other people that don't believe in doctors. And, well, it didn't make it. So, anyway, that's that story with a few others. Now, the story of Susanna and the elders has been a popular bit to read, certainly in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. A whole lot of painters, famous painters, have painted Susanna and the elders. It's a little racy, and they liked a little racy stuff. Rembrandt painted Susanna and the elders. So, it is sometimes called the world's first detective story. I call it, one of the first about people, men in power, trying to harass sexually women who have no power. Now, Susanna was married to Joachim. Joachim was very wealthy. This is in the Exile. He has a lovely place with a big garden in the back. And Susanna is the picture of loveliness. She turns heads, literally. But a lovely lady, very pious, good Jewish girl. So, and then they get 2 new judges in town, elders, as it were. And right off the bat, the author lets you know these guys are guys on the take. They're corrupt, but they can't take their eyes off of Susanna. They are overcome with lust. And so they hang around all the time just to look at her. And indeed, behind bushes and things like that. And they hang around together, kind of looking at her. And then they say one day, well, it's time for lunch. And then they split up. And of course, they both came back, not knowing the other one was doing it, and had to confess to each other the kind of lust they had for Susanna. So the 2 of them get on a plot together to see if they can get their will accomplished with her. Now, this lovely garden in the back had a pool in it, and Susanna wants to, well, she goes back there with her maid, and it's a hot day, she wants to take a little bath, she wants to bathe in the pool. She sends her maid back to get the oils and unguents and all the stuff that people bathed with in those days. And, she begins to disrobe, and out pop these 2 nasty, dirty old men, the elders, and they have been waiting behind the bushes, and they come out and tell her flat off, we want you to lie with us. Yeah, they want to have sex. And if you don't have sex with us, we're going to run out and scream out to the world that you had a young man in here and you were having sex with him. So poor Susanna is absolutely caught, and she says, what can I do? I can't win on this. If I don't give in to them, they will bear false witness, and I'll be ruined and stoned. If I do give in to them, I will have offended the Lord, and that is even worse. And she refuses to do it. She refuses to concede to their sexual harassment schemes. So they run out of the street, yelling, saying, there was a young man with Susanna, and they were up against a tree. Oh, dear. So, there it was. Well, the 2 elders, the 2 judges, of course, testify against her in their own court, and she is condemned to death by stoning. And she's innocent. So, they begin to lead Susanna away to execute her. And Susanna cries out to the Lord God to have mercy on her, knowing that she is innocent. And at that very minute then, a voice pipes up to the side, a young man who says, I will not have this young woman's blood on my soul. And he is the young Daniel. Daniel, who shows up all over. Now, this is the young Daniel, which means that this story should be put at the first of the book of Daniel, if it were to go in. And so, he says, just the 2 of you, judge? You were the judge and the jury? Well, no, we don't do things like that amongst the Jews. Let's get the people together again. The people come together again, and he tells the officials, separate these 2 and don't let them talk to each other. Now, we're used to that from all the detective stories, so they can't come up with a common story. So sure enough, he brings out the first one, and Daniel says, you sat up against a tree. What kind of tree was it? And the elder says, why, it was a mastic tree. So Daniel sends him away, brings the other one in and says, you've said you've seen it up against a tree. What kind of tree was it? And he said, an oak tree. And Daniel said, you have condemned yourselves out of your own mouths. And so then the people said, they are guilty, take them away to be executed. So it's the 2 corrupt old men who try their sexual harassment against the pious Susanna, who lose in the end, and everyone thought even more highly of Susanna, who was willing to endure execution to maintain her purity. So this is why that was a story that was very, very popular back in the day. Okay, the Apocrypha. I hope some of you can get it and read those stories. There's some very interesting stories. There are lots of wise sayings. There's some lovely poems of praise to God in there. So that we have now looked at 3 different kinds of things. We've looked at reading the Gospel of Matthew through Jewish eyes and the customs of that day. We've gone through the book of Revelation and why people today think it still is written for us. It was written for the church back then, but the human state being what it is, it's real easy to take pieces of that and apply it to this day. And then we have looked at the Apocrypha, something many Episcopalians don't get around to reading, and I hope that you do. So that concludes this session and this series of interesting and sometimes naughty stories from the Bible. Thank you all.